Tanashtane Rupa Goshani Shunera Bhagavata Prabhura Kripaya Tenho Krishna Premi Mata. Someone else? Tanrashtane, in his place, Rupa Goshani, Srila Rupa Goswami, Shunera, heard, Bhagavata, the recitation of Srimad Bhagavatam, Prabhura Kripaya, by the mercy of Lord Caitanya, Teno, he, Kripa Preme, in love of Krishna, Mata, always maddened. Translation and purport by Srila Prabhupada. While he stayed with Srila Rupa Goswami, his engagement was to recite Srimad Bhagavatam for him to hear. As a result of this Bhagavatam recitation, he attained perfectional love of Krishna, by which he remained always maddened. Please repeat. While he stayed with Srila Rupa Goswami, his engagement was to recite Srimad Bhagavatam for him to hear. As a result of this Bhagavatam recitation, he attained perfectional love of Krishna, by which he remained always maddened. Purport. Raghunath Bhattacharya, or Raghunath Bhatta Goswami, one of the 6 Goswamis, was the son of Tapan Mishra. Born in approximately 1425 Shakabda, he was expert in reciting Srimad Bhagavatam. And in the Adi-lila, chapter 30, it is stated that he was also expert in cooking. Whatever he cooked would be nectarian. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was greatly pleased to accept the foodstuffs that he cooked, and Raghunath Bhatta used to take the remnants of foodstuffs left by Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Raghunath Bhattacharya lived for 8 months in Jagannath Puri, after which Lord Chaitanya ordered him to go to Vrindavan to join Sri Rupa Goswami. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu asked Raghunath Bhattacharya not to marry, but to remain a brahmachari. And he also ordered him to read Srimad Bhagavatam constantly. Thus he went to Vrindavan, where he engaged in reciting Srimad Bhagavatam to Srila Rupa Goswami. He was so expert in reciting Srimad Bhagavatam that he would recite each and every verse in 3 melodious tunes. While Raghunath Bhatta Goswami was living with Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the Lord blessed him by offering him betel nuts offered to the Jagannath deity and a garland of tulsi said to be as long as 14 cubits. The Govinda temple was constructed by Raghunath Bhatta Goswami's order to one of his disciples. Raghunath Bhatta Goswami supplied all the ornaments of the Govinda deity. He never talked of nonsense or worldly matters, but always engaged in hearing about Krishna 24 hours a day. He never cared to hear blasphemy of a Vaishnava. Even when there were points to be criticized, he used to say that since all the Vaishnavas were engaged in the service of the Lord, he did not mind their faults. Later, Raghunath Bhatta Goswami lived at Radhakund in a small cottage. In the Goro Ganadesh Dipika, verse 185, it is said that Raghunath Bhatta Goswami was formerly the gopi named Raga Manjari. Omagyanan Timirandasya Ginanjana Shalakaya Chakshu Unmanitam Jena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha. Mukam Karoti Vachalam Pangum Langhaite Garim Yakripa Tamaham Vande Sri Gurum Dinatanam. I was born in the darkness of ignorance. My spiritual master has very kindly come, forced open my eyes with the torchlight of transcendental knowledge. I offer my most respectful obeisances unto his lotus feet. By the kindness of the spiritual master, the saviour of all fallen souls, even a lame man can cross over mountains, a blind man can see stars in the sky, and a dumb man can recite eloquent Vedic poetry. So I might just read a couple of verses preceding this, just to... So these are a couple of verses. When Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu stayed at the house of Tapan Misra, Raghunath Bhatta, who was then a boy, washed his dishes and massaged his legs. When Raghunath grew to be a young man, he visited Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu at Jagannath Puri and stayed there for 8 months. Sometimes he offered prasad to the Lord. Later, by the order of Lord Chaitanya, Raghunath went to Vrindavan and remained there under the shelter of Srila Rupa Goswami. And the verse before that, even the prominent devotees at Varanasi were the physician Chandrasekhar, Tapan Misra, and Raghunath Bhattacharya, Tapan Misra's son. When Lord Chaitanya came to Varanasi after seeing Vrindavan for 2 months, he lived at the residence of Chandrasekhar Vaidya and accepted prasad at the house of Tapan Misra. So one of the prominent Goswamis, 6 Goswamis, Prabhupada referred to them as the band of Goswamis, Srila Raghunath Bhatta Goswami. And very fortunate, exalted personality in Goloka Vrindavan. He's serving their lordships in his form as Raga Manjari. So, it's interesting that Srila Raghunath Bhatta Goswami and also Gopal Bhatta Goswami, they did a lot of the initiating of Gaudiya Vaishnavas in the Sampradaya, the Chaitanya Sampradaya, also known as, we are known as Rupanugas, or this is known as the Rupanuga Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya. So one may ask, and for example, Srila Rupa Goswami only had one initiated disciple, and that was his nephew Jiva. And the reason for that is that both Rupa and Sanatana Goswamis, even though they were the most senior of the Goswamis and direct disciples of Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, because they had been ostracized from Brahminical culture, having formerly been employed by Nawab Hussain Shah, the Emperor of Bengal, they considered themselves outside the Vedic culture. So they didn't want to create some social discord, upset that. So they preferred not to initiate, but yet they were acknowledged widely as the principal instructing spiritual masters for all the Gaudiya Vaishnavas, Rupa and Sanatana. Raghunath Das Goswami, he accepted some disciples because he hadn't formerly been in that situation. For example, either initiating and or instructing. Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami is definitely considered at least a Shiksha disciple of Raghunath Das Goswami. Some say also Diksha, others say Lord Nityananda was his initiating spiritual master. But Raghunath Bhatta and Gopal Bhatta, and also because they were from Brahmin caste, and the Brahminical culture was so strict in those days, so rigid, that they maintained that system. And in this way the Gaudiya Sampradaya expanded. And one of the foremost disciples of Raghunath Bhatta Goswami was Maharaj Man Singh, who was one of Emperor Akbar's commanders-in-chief of one of his armies. And he had amassed great wealth, Maharaj Man Singh. And he came to Vrindavan and was very much impressed with Srila Rupa Goswami and Raghunath Bhatta Goswami and all the Goswamis. And he was a Vaishnava, a Gaudiya Vaishnava. And having enormous wealth, he wanted to do some service. And it's interesting, in one lecture, Prabhupada refers to him as a rascal. He says that this rascal Man Singh, he's a great Kshatriya king or commander-in-chief. And what's he going to spend his money on? If he's just going to spend it on nonsensical things. So Rupa and Raghunath Bhatta, they engaged Man Singh's fabulous wealth in building a gorgeous temple for Govindaji. And historically, the stone which was used to construct the magnificent 7-story, originally, temple for Radha Govinda, it was red sandstone, which in those days was only ever used to build emperors' and kings' palaces. It was very rare, not in abundance, and considered the best stone available for constructing magnificent buildings. But due to the influence of Rupa and Raghunath Bhatta Goswamis, Man Singh, he obtained that, he paid for that, and he helped in the gorgeous construction of that magnificent temple. Of course, some decades later, at least 4 stories of that temple were desecrated and demolished by the very envious Hindu-hating Islamist Mughal of the time, Aurangzeb. And as is the tradition in Vishnu temples, being so hideously desecrated, that building was then not rebuilt, but a separate building right behind the original Govindaji temple was constructed, and that's there in Vrindavan. So this is a wonderful incident in the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Such a wonderful personality. It's said that Raghunath Bhatta Goswami, he lived to be 77 years of age, and he, Rupa and Sanatan Goswamis all passed away from this world within 1 month of each other, 3 consecutive months in the latter part of the year, starting in what is our August month. One of them left, and then the next month another one left, and then the third month the third left, like that, because they were so attached to one another. They were brothers and had lived in Vrindavan for a long time and could not bear separation from one another. It's said also that Raghunath Das Goswami, after Lord Caitanya and Swarup Damodar passed away in Jagannath Puri, that Raghunath Das Goswami, he couldn't bear the separation, and he left Jagannath Puri and went to Vrindavan, where he was planning to commit suicide. due to intense feelings of separation. But Rupa and Sanatan encouraged him, to live on in this world and to recite Mahaprabhu's pastimes every day to the assembled devotees for at least an hour or two, which he did at Radhakunda. So such intense feelings of separation are there between exalted devotees and other devotees, and also between the devotees and the Supreme Lord. So, and it's interesting that in the preceding verses, the father of Raghunath Bhatta Goswami, Tapan Mishra, he met Chaitanya Mahaprabhu when Lord Chaitanya was newly married for the first time and went to East Bengal to acquire wealth through teaching. Tapan Mishra met him there. And Tapan Mishra was, in his conversation with Mahaprabhu, he revealed that he'd studied many different shastras, but he couldn't ascertain what was the ultimate goal of life. So Mahaprabhu gave him wonderful instructions and actually gave him Harinam initiation. So right there, right then, which was quite wonderful. And he ordered him to go and live in Varanasi, which he did with his wife. And a short time later, the couple had this wonderful baby boy who was to grow up as Raghunath Bhatta. And Mahaprabhu indicated that he would come there at some future point in time, which he did after the Lord accepted sannyas. And Tapan Mishra one day was down by the river Ganga in Varanasi and performing his morning spiritual practices. When he heard this, as he approached the Ganga, he could hear this tumultuous kirtan, and it was Hari Kirtan. Varanasi is, of course, very famous as the city of Lord Shiva, and there are many impersonalists residing there, but many pious persons as well. And some Vaishnavas. So Tapan Mishra was hearing this tumultuous kirtan, chanting the Hare Krishna Maha Mantra, and as he turned the corner, he noticed a huge crowd of people, and there was one effulgent, very tall sannyasi in the midst of the kirtan, dancing exuberantly. And he was looking and looking, and he thought, this looks like Nimai Pandit, who he hadn't seen for a few years. But he couldn't recognize him initially because this personality had a shaved head, and whereas formerly Nimai Pandit was wearing beautiful, long, shoulder-length, black, curly hair, and he was, of course, dressed as a Brahmin Pandit. Here is this sannyasi in saffron cloth. But as he drew nearer, he could recognize the unmistakable characteristics of Lord Chaitanya. So he offered obeisances, and there was a very touching reunion between the Lord and his confidential associate. And it was at that time that Tapan Mishra's young son got an opportunity to serve Mahaprabhu. He would serve the Lord his meals and massage his lotus feet and so on. So the relationship developed from there. And over the years after Mahaprabhu went back from his touring to Jagannath Puri, then Raghunath Bhatta Goswami actually went to Puri on 2 occasions, and each time he stayed for a period of 8 months. So it's quite an extended period of time. And a similar incident happened also on this tour. Just as Tapan Mishra was having difficulty ascertaining from reading so many different shastras what was the goal of life, there's another wonderful personality who had a similar experience, and his name is Raghupati Upadhyaya. And he also met Chaitanya Mahaprabhu on the Lord's tour of North India in the region of Brajadam, Vrindavan. And Raghupati Upadhyaya is described by Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami in the 19th chapter of the Adi-lila. And he's described there as a Brahmin, a Vaishnava, a scholar, poet, and a perfect gentleman. And on one occasion, a disciple asked Srila Prabhupada what would please him the most. And this disciple was a staunch book distributor. So Prabhupada responded that you become a perfect gentleman. So Raghupati Upadhyaya was one such perfect gentleman. And when he first met Mahaprabhu, Mahaprabhu was in the association of Srila Rupa Goswami and other devotees at the time. And Vallabhacharya was there also. And Mahaprabhu had taken the opportunity to go and visit Vallabhacharya, who had come to visit him in Jagannath Puri. And Vallabhacharya was a great scholar, great devotee. So Mahaprabhu was reciprocating with him. And it's very interesting because Vallabhacharya went on to establish his own Vaishnava, or revive a Vaishnava Sampradaya on the western side of India, and become the leader of that. And that Sampradaya is in the line of Vishnu Swami, or the Rudra Sampradaya. And it would appear that at that time in history there was a vacancy for an Acharya, and being immensely qualified, Vallabhacharya accepted that post. And he was also a very good friend of Rupa Goswami. So Raghupati Upadhyaya was asked a number of questions by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Just as Mahaprabhu inquired from Ramananda Roy when they first met on the banks of the Godavari River in South India, Mahaprabhu took the position of pupil and inquired from Ramananda Roy, asked him different questions. That's a very famous conversation known as the Roy Ramananda Samvad. So in this situation also, the Lord took the position of inquiring, and he asked him, first of all, what is the most charming form of Sri Krishna? To which Raghupati Upadhyaya responded, the Lord's form as Shyamasundar, threefold bending form playing the flute. Another question was, what is the most charming pastime of the Lord? To which Raghupati Upadhyaya responded, the Lord's searching in the kunjas, the groves and bushes of the 12 forests of Vrindavan for his consorts, the gopis. He also asked him, what is the most charming mellow? To which Raghupati replied, the mellow of conjugal love. He also asked him, what is the most charming abode? To which Raghupati replied, the Lord's city of Mathura and the surrounding districts, which include Vrindavan. And he finally asked him, what is the most charming age of Krishna? To which he replied, adolescence, blooming youth. You could say from the ages of 12, 13 to 16. So, and Raghupati Upadhyaya, like Tapan Mishra, was vastly learned. He'd studied all the different shastras. And he was famous as a poet, and Rupa Goswami knew this. And he'd composed some beautiful verses, Raghupati Upadhyaya. So Mahaprabhu asked him a little bit about himself and his background. What was his meditation? What was his sadhana, spiritual practice, and sadhya? What was the goal of his spiritual practices? So they were having this discussion, and he replied that there are many persons who are fearful of death and rebirth. So they study all the different Vedic literatures, especially the Upanishads, Mahabharata, which contains Bhagavad Gita, the Puranas, and so on. But as far as he was concerned, his meditation, he said, I meditate on Nanda Maharaj, because in Nanda Maharaj's courtyard, the Supreme Absolute Truth, Parabrahman, is crawling as the most delightful, charming infant. So that was his, and that verse you can find, and I looked it up yesterday, along with at least 4 other verses, in Rupa Goswami's Padyavali, which is a book of poems, an anthology of poetry is what Padyavali means. And we managed to read about 100 verses there, and at least 5 of those are beautiful verses composed by Raghupati Upadhyaya. He was a Matila Brahmin by caste, very exalted personality. So, and it was at that time that Mahaprabhu actually embraced him. And of course, Raghupati Upadhyaya went into complete ecstasy. Rupa Goswami was there, and Vallabhacharya and others, and they saw this incredible good fortune that Raghupati received. And at that point, he realized that Mahaprabhu was not an ordinary human being, that he was the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So these wonderful pastimes we'll read as we move through this incredible Caitanya Caritamrita. And one other wonderful, and of course, by Prabhupada's kindness, we have these nectarian books to read, and we hold them in the highest regard. Shastra, Shruti Pramana. The word pramana means evidence. And Prabhupada many times mentions how there are different evidences we can gain knowledge from. And pratyaksha means direct perception, knowledge we can acquire through our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and tactile sense of touch. Definitely gain a lot of knowledge that way. Then there is what's known as anuman, or logical argument. You can debate something, and by logic or deduction you can come to some conclusion. There is also other forms of evidence, upamana, or analogy. Prabhupada used analogies to great effect in his preaching. And then there is tradition. That's known as ati-ya. But topmost, the best type of conclusions to draw and evidence is known as shabda. Shruti Praman, Shruti and Shmiti, that which is coming down from higher authorities. Ad hoc saja, The Supreme Lord, who is not subject to the defects of conditioned souls, doesn't commit mistakes, not imperfect senses, no cheating. I always get three out of 4. What's the last one? Yeah. It's true. Imperfect senses, cheating propensity, subject to illusion and committing mistakes. Thank you, Vasishrestha. So, at Hoksaja, Krishna, he is not subject to those. And also, apurushaya means not of human origin. Purusha means human being. Apurusha means... So the Vedic literatures, they're described as coming from non-human origin. In other words, the Supreme Person. And as we've said recently, there are 3 co-eternals, the Supreme Lord, the living entities, you and I, and the Vedic literatures. They're also described as a co-eternal. So, and in the course, and of course on this wonderful path of bhakti, we have faith, which is in Sanskrit shraddha, and we also have nishta. Prabhupada gives a wonderful translation of shraddha in the 3rd chapter of Bhagavad Gita, unflinching trust in something sublime. And he also translates the word nishta, which is a part of a very famous verse, Ado Shraddha Tata Sadhu Sangas Tabhajana Kriya Tato Anartha Nivrittisha Tato Nista Ruchistata, as firm conviction. Nishta means firm conviction. And towards the end of Prabhupada's life, at least one disciple, very senior disciple, carrying enormous responsibilities on behalf of Prabhupada, came to see His Divine Grace just before Prabhupada's final disappearance pastime, and Prabhupada asked him, "Are you convinced?" Because Prabhupada had invested enormous energy in establishing the Krishna consciousness movement, and he wanted it to go on even after his physical departure. So this senior disciple did answer in the affirmative, "Yes, Srila Prabhupada, I am convinced." So obviously that conviction is there, firm conviction, nishta. So there's another wonderful verse similar to which is Yasya Devi Para Bhakti Yatta Devi Tata Guru Tasyahi Kahita Hiyata Prakashante Mahatmanaha. For one who has implicit faith in one's spiritual master and the Supreme Lord, all the imports of Vedic knowledge are automatically revealed. And Prabhupada used himself as an example of someone who had this unflinching faith in the words of Bhakti-Sananda Saraswati and Sri Krishna, that Krishna Bhakti could be embraced and practiced by persons outside of Vedic India. And armed with that firm conviction, he came to the Western world. So that he used himself as an example, that he had a complete faith in the words of Bhakti-Siddhanta Saraswati and his father Bhaktivinoda Thakur, and they were already pioneers themselves in trying to spread Krishna consciousness, Mahaprabhu's sublime teachings, beyond the borders of India. And the other wonderful example is there of the illiterate Brahmin in South India who had been instructed by his guru to read a chapter of Bhagavad Gita every day, even though he was illiterate. And even though the local people who knew him in that particular temple in South India would make fun of him because they knew he couldn't read, but still he's turning the pages and simultaneously he's weeping. And when Mahaprabhu met this particular devotee and heard his story, then he praised him as the greatest scholar of Bhagavad Gita. Because, and this devotee said, whenever I look at the cover of Bhagavad Gita and see the Lord as Parthasarathi, the charioteer of his devotee Arjuna, how the Lord accepts that menial position, serves his devotee, I just become overwhelmed with loving ecstasy for our Lord. So there were two wonderful examples. Another profound example in the history of our Gaudiya Sampradaya is the guru-disciple relationship between Srila Gurkhasha Das Babaji Maharaj and his one and only disciple Srila Bhakti-Sananda Saraswati. It's interesting because Gurkhasha Das Babaji was also illiterate. He was a grain broker in his earlier life, and when his wife passed away, he became a renunciant and moved from his village to Brajadam and lived there for 30 years. And after he heard that Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj had rediscovered the actual birth site of Mahaprabhu in Mayapur, he moved to Mayapur and he spent the rest of his life there. And it's really intriguing because when Bhakti-Sananda Saraswati, of course in his younger days, his family name was Bimala Prasad Datta, and Sri Varsha Banavi Daitya Das was the name he was given a little bit later by Srila Gurkhasha Das Babaji, and in his later life, after accepting the renounced order, he became known as Bhakti-Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So when he first laid eyes on Srila Gurkhasha Das Babaji, soon after Babaji Maharaj had arrived in Navadvip, and was pointed out to him by his father Bhaktivinoda that just what an exalted Paramahamsa Vaishnava he was, he realized that Srila Gurkhasha Das Babaji looked straight into his heart. And Bhakti-Siddhanta Saraswati was a young man at that time and immensely well educated, both materially and spiritually. It's said that he was not only a great astronomer, but he was also a very proficient mathematician. He was known as walking encyclopedia. But he realized that his soon-to-become initiating spiritual master didn't care a fig for all of his knowledge. And that was very humbling for him, and he was very grateful to Srila Gurkhasha Das Babaji Maharaj. And it's really interesting also, for those of us who like to get into the details of some of these events in the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. But one could say, why didn't father initiate son? Why didn't Bhaktivinoda Thakur initiate? Of course, he had 10 children, could have initiated all of them. So, according to scholars, and Srila Siddhanta Saraswati always acknowledged this, he did actually have two gurus, and one of them most definitely was his biological father, Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And he is described as his Bhagavat, Panama Paraguru, also his Shravan Guru, and his Bhajan Guru, because he taught his son all of these different esoteric teachings when Siddhanta Saraswati was just a young man. But there was an event where Bhaktivinoda Thakur invited his initiating spiritual master, Vipin Bihari Goswami, to his house one time. And as is the custom, he bathed his initiating spiritual master's lotus feet and took the opportunity to Bhakti-Vinod to put his head on the feet of Vipin Bihari Goswami. And Bhakti-Siddhanta Saraswati, even as a young man, he observed this and he didn't like it. He said, this is the wrong way round. Vipin Bihari Goswami should be putting his head on my father's feet, because he understood his father was a much more elevated Vaishnava than his initiating spiritual master. But he didn't make a fuss, but it appears that afterwards father and son discussed the matter, and Bhakti-Vinod realised that his son was never going to take initiation because he didn't have the Shraddha, he didn't have the faith in Vipin Bihari Goswami. So he directed him towards Srila Gurkhasha Das Babaji Maharaj for initiation. And though there are examples in history of fathers initiating their sons and serving as initiating spiritual masters, sometimes because of familiarity, it's not considered the best. Better they take initiation from someone else. Familiarity breeds contempt in some instances. And that actually did manifest in a famous quote from Srila Bhakti-Siddhanta Saraswati much later on in life, where he referred to his father as Sri Sangi, one who was very attached to women, because Bhakti-Vinod Thakur, even though a Paramahamsa Vaishnava, he stayed with his wife right up until just 2 or 3 years before he passed away. Of course, his wife was no ordinary lady. She was a great Vaishnavi, Bhagavati Devi. But still this familiarity is there somehow or other. So, and it has to be a question of the heart, faith, intense faith in taking initiation and acceptance. So we've just about run out of time, everyone. I might stop there, and if anyone has a question or a comment, you can try and respond. Yes?
I'm just wondering, who is Gurkhasha?
Yes, well, that's a very good question, because he has initiating spiritual master was Bipin Bihari Goswami, or Bipin Bihari Ghosh, who was a Vaishnava, exalted Vaishnava, no doubt, but born in a Brahmin family. But it appears that there may have even been some disagreement between them over the position of, some say, Garadhar Pandit. So when Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj came to Mayapur, and he was very elderly, and he is known as Sarvabhauma, which means the commander-in-chief of all the Gaudiya Vaishnavas. Srila Bhakti-Vinod Thakur accepted him as his instructing spiritual master. And our Gaudiya line is more prominent as a Shiksha line than a Diksha line. That's why you won't see on any ISKCON altars, and in India quite often, because they have big altars in India, you'll quite often see a painting, an illustration of Srila Jagannath Das Babaji Maharaj after Srila Bhakti-Vinod Thakur. You'll see that, because but you won't see a painting of Bipin Bihari Goswami. Yeah, is that okay? Yeah, there was some disagreement, but most importantly, the Shiksha line is considered more important than the Diksha. Yeah. And another example of that is the relationship Baladev Vijayabhusana and Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur. They are, when you read our Guru Parampara coming all the way down, you will see that the links in the chain at that particular time, which was the 17th century, Baladev Vijayabhusana, he is mentioned there, but he was not an initiated disciple of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, but he was his Shiksha disciple. He had accepted initiation from another great Gaudiya Vaishnava in Jagannath Puri, who actually sent him to Vrindavan. So in this way, our Shiksha line instructing is considered, more prominent. You're welcome. Anything else? All right, Jai Ho. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Sri Caitanya Charitamrita ki jai.